You will be begging to return by winter. The words, spoken by the Duke of Kestrel Chase, were not cruel. They were a statement of fact, as cold and hard as the granite of his reputation. They hung in the air of the Duke's London study, a room so silent one could hear the faint hiss of the gaslight. Prudence Vickers stood before him, her hands clasped loosely at her waist. She did not flinch. She did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with fact was a waste of breath, and a duke's pronouncement was considered fact by all who mattered. She simply inclined her head. "I understand the terms, Your Grace." He watched her, his eyes the colour of a winter sky just before a storm. Gideon Devereux had been a fixture in the periphery of her life for years, a name whispered in awe and fear, a reclusive figure who had sealed himself away in his country seat after the death of his young wife. Now he was here, solid and intimidating, his gaze missing nothing. It was this unnerving attention that had led her to this impossible moment. The chain of events had begun, as so many of her troubles did, at her aunt's dinner table. Lady Honora Bellamy believed that the purpose of a meal was not sustenance, but strategy. Prudence, her orphaned niece, was a key but unacknowledged piece of that strategy, the silent, efficient engine that kept the Bellamy household running. For 7 years, since she had come to live with them at 19, Prudence had managed the accounts, placated the staff, written the correspondence, and stretched every shilling until it screamed. She was the family's memory and its balance sheet, and for this, she received a small room at the top of the house and the constant, grating reminder of her dependency. Her cousin, Rosamond, was the family's glittering asset. Beautiful, charming, and possessed of an education that had taught her French and watercolours, but not how to add a column of figures, Rosamond was destined for a brilliant match. The current candidate was Mr. Osmond Sinclair, a man with a polished smile, an impeccable wardrobe, and eyes that never quite settled. Prudence disliked him instantly. He looked at Rosamond as if she were a prize mare, and at the Bellamy silver with an unnerving acquisitiveness. The Duke's presence at dinner was a coup for Lady Honora. It had been secured through a distant family connection and much pleading. He was the great, cold whale they hoped to land, if not for Rosamond, then for the social prestige his mere attendance would confer. He sat through the meal in near total silence, a black-clad monument to grief, deflecting conversation with monosyllabic answers. The trouble started over the port. Mr. Sinclair, eager to impress the Duke with his knowledge of country matters, began pontificating about the management of a local farm tenancy. "The rents in this part of the county are criminally low," he declared, swirling his glass. "Any landlord worth his salt would have raised them by 20% 2 years ago. It's simply leaving money on the table." Lady Honora nodded vigorously. "Osmond is so very clever about these things, Your Grace." The Duke's gaze remained fixed on the tablecloth. "Is that so?" "Indeed," Sinclair pressed on, warming to his theme. "Take the old Draycott farm, for instance. I happen to know the lease was last settled at a rate that is now laughable." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed the Duke's face. "The Draycott farm is part of my estate." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Mr. Sinclair's face lost some of its colour. Well, a hypothetical, of course. An example of general principles." "The Draycott lease was renegotiated 11 months ago," a quiet voice said. Every head turned. Prudence felt the heat rise in her own cheeks. She had not meant to speak aloud. The numbers simply lived in her head, demanding correction. Her aunt's eyes shot daggers at her.
"Prudence, really?" Lady Honora began, her voice a low hiss. But the Duke lifted his head. For the first time that evening, he looked directly at her. "Explain," he commanded. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She kept her voice steady, her gaze on a point just past his shoulder. "The old lease was based on arable production, Mr. Sinclair, but the lower fields have flooded twice in 5 years. The new lease, negotiated by your agent last October, is based on a lower rent for pasture, with a clause for a percentage of the profits from the sheep flock. It is, in fact, more profitable than the old arrangement would have been, even at a higher rate." She recited the figures from memory, the exact dates, the shillings and pence. The room was utterly still. Mr. Sinclair looked as if he had swallowed a wasp. Rosamond stared at her cousin as if she had just sprouted a second head. Lady Honora's face was a mask of fury. The Duke did not smile. His expression did not change. But his eyes remained on her, and the quality of his attention had shifted. It was no longer passive. It was assessing. It was the look of a man who dealt in facts, who had just been handed a very unexpected one. "You have a good memory, Miss Vickers," he said, the words falling like stones into the silence. She felt a flush of shame, of exposure. "I manage my aunt's accounts," she murmured, an apology and an explanation in one. He gave a single, sharp nod. The conversation moved on, limping and awkward, but the moment was branded into the evening. Prudence had done the one thing she was never supposed to do. She had been noticed. And she had been noticed by the one man whose attention nobody courted, for fear of what it might find. She felt not triumph, but a deep and chilling premonition. She had corrected a fool in front of a king, and she was not sure which of them was more dangerous. The summons came the following afternoon. A footman in the Duke's livery, delivering a note addressed not to Lady Honora, but to Miss Prudence Vickers. Her aunt had snatched it from the salver, her face tight with suspicion. "What is the meaning of this? What did you do?" "I answered a question, Aunt," Prudence had replied, her voice betraying none of the tremor in her hands. Now, standing in his study, she understood. He had not been angry. He had been intrigued. He had a problem, and he believed she might be the solution. "Withercombe," he said, breaking the silence. The name of the estate was a shard of glass in his voice. "It was my late wife's property, her dowry house. It has been without proper stewardship for 5 years. It loses money. £700 last year alone." Prudence's mind, ever the accountant, immediately began to calculate. A £700 loss was not merely neglect, it was a hemorrhage. "I will not sell it," he stated, his jaw tight. "But I will not see it rot. My agents are competent but overburdened. The estate needs a single, dedicated mind. It needs someone who understands accounts, who is not afraid of work, and who does not engage in hypotheticals." The faintest edge of contempt touched his voice as he recalled Mr. Sinclair's performance. He gestured to a chair. She did not take it. She preferred to stand. It felt less like a petition. "You saw my ledgers for this household last night. My man obtained them from your aunt's butler." Prudence felt a cold knot form in her stomach. He had investigated her. He had gone through her work, the meticulous columns of figures that told the story of her life. It was a violation. It was also, she admitted to herself, thorough.
You turned a profit of £90 for your aunt last quarter, on an income that should have produced a deficit, he continued, his tone devoid of praise, merely stating another fact. You renegotiated with the wine merchant, the butcher, and the coal supplier.
You discovered the head groom was selling my aunt's horse feed and dismissed him. You did all of this, and no one noticed. It was not pity in his voice. It was something harder and more respectful. It was recognition. It was a language she understood far better than flattery. I am offering you a position, he said plainly. You will go to Withercombe. You will have full authority as its steward. You will have access to my accounts, my agents, and a modest budget for repairs. Your task is to make it solvent. You will be paid a salary of £100 per annum. £100. It was more money than she had ever held in her life. It was freedom. It was an escape from the daily humiliations, from her aunt's temper and Rosamond's pity, and Mr. Sinclair's oily presence. It was a chance to have something that was hers, even if it was just a job. But then he delivered the final, chilling assessment. The house is a ruin. The tenants are demoralized. The land is sour. It is a place of ghosts, Miss Vickers. My wife, she loved it, but she did not know how to care for it. It has had no heart for 5 years. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and piercing. You will be begging to return to Marley by winter. It was a challenge, a warning, a test. He was laying out the worst of it to see if she would break. She thought of her little room under the eaves, the drip of the leaking roof into a bucket on rainy nights. She thought of her aunt's voice, sharp with displeasure over a penny unaccounted for. She thought of the future stretching before her, a slow, gray descent into permanent spinsterhood, forever dependent on the charity of relatives who despised her usefulness, even as they exploited it. Then she thought of Withercombe, a ruin, a place of ghosts, a problem to be solved. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. She would not beg. She had never begged for anything in her life. I accept your offer, Your Grace, Prudence Vickers said. When do I start? Her departure was a thing of quiet haste. Lady Honora flew into a rage, accusing Prudence of base ingratitude, of social climbing, of abandoning her family. He will toss you out the moment you fail, she shrieked. And do not think you can come crawling back here. Rosamond, to Prudence's surprise, wept. But who will help me with my letters? Who will make sure my allowance lasts the month? The questions were entirely selfish, yet in them, Prudence heard a note of genuine, pathetic panic. Her cousin was a ship accustomed to a rudder, now set adrift. Mr. Sinclair offered his condolences with a smile that did not reach his eyes. A shame to see you rusticate, Miss Vickers, but perhaps a bit of country air will do you good. He saw her as a piece of furniture being moved to the attic, and was glad of it. Prudence packed her 2 worn trunks herself. She owned little of value, save for a few books, and a small dented silver locket she wore on a ribbon around her neck. It had been her mother's. Inside was not a portrait, but a tiny, faded watercolor of a single, hardy wildflower, a reminder of a different life, a different home, long before this one. The Duke's carriage arrived for her precisely at 8 o'clock on a cool September morning. As she stepped out of the Bellamy house for the last time, she did not look back. The house had been a prison, and she was being granted not a pardon, but a transfer to a different kind of exile. An exile with a salary, an exile with a purpose. The journey to Withercombe took the better part of a day,
moving from the manicured lanes of Marley into wilder, more untamed country. The carriage turned onto a long, rutted drive, branches scraping against the roof. And then she saw it. Withercombe was not a ruin in the romantic sense. It was not covered in picturesque ivy. It was simply succumbing. The gray stone of the house was stained with damp. Several shutters hung askew, like broken teeth. The gardens were a riot of weeds and overgrown shrubs, choking the life out of what might once have been elegant parterres. The air itself felt heavy, still, and sorrowful. It was a house that had given up. The carriage door was opened by a grim-faced man in his 60s. His livery was clean, but frayed at the cuffs. "Miss Vickers," he stated, his voice raspy. "I am Hob, the butler. What there is of one." Inside, the chill was even more profound. A vast, echoing hall held furniture shrouded in white dust cloths, like a congregation of ghosts. The air smelled of damp stone, mice, and memory. A woman with a severe expression and iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun stood waiting. Her apron was starched, a small bastion of order in a sea of decay. "I am Hannah, the housekeeper," she announced, her eyes sweeping over Prudence's plain traveling dress with an expression that was not quite disdain. It was evaluation. "There is a staff of 4. Myself, Hob, a kitchen girl, and a stable boy who sees to the grounds. We do what we can." Her tone implied it was not nearly enough. Prudence did not offer false cheer or grand pronouncements. She simply nodded. "Thank you, Hannah. If you would show me to my room, and then I should like to see the account books." The ledgers were the heart of any house, and she knew Withercombes would tell her the true story. Hannah led her up a grand, uncarpeted staircase to a modest suite of rooms overlooking the blighted gardens. The furniture was old, but well made. A fire had been laid in the hearth, though not lit. "The Duke sent word. These were to be your rooms," Hannah said, her voice flat. They were his late wife's morning room and study. Prudence felt a sudden, sharp pang of intrusion. She was an interloper in a dead woman's life. Then she pushed the feeling away. This was not a shrine. It was a place of business. Her business. For the next hour, she sat not in the study, but at a small, scarred table in the adjoining bedroom, the Withercombe ledgers spread before her. They were a disaster. Entries were sporadic, written in a dozen different hands. Bills had been paid twice, while others had been left for years. There was no system, no order, only financial chaos. The £700 loss was not a mystery. It was an inevitability. She did not feel despair. She felt a strange, quiet thrill. It was a puzzle. A monumental, broken, complicated puzzle. And she knew how to solve it. She worked until the light faded, her pen scratching in the silence. She was not making entries. She was starting a new book, a clean one, transferring what little solid information she could find and making a list of questions, a mountain of them. When the kitchen girl, a shy creature named Tilly, brought her a tray with bread, cheese, and a small apple, Prudence realized she had not eaten since morning. The next day, she did not confine herself to the house. She put on a pair of sturdy boots she had insisted on packing and began to walk. She walked the estate from boundary to boundary. She saw the fields the Duke had described, the low-lying ones waterlogged and covered in rushes. She saw the tenant farms, the cottages with sagging roofs and broken fences. She spoke to the tenants, not as a lady of the manor, but as a woman asking plain questions. What did they need? Why was this field fallow? Where did the water come from? They were suspicious at first, their answers guarded. They were accustomed to neglect. But Prudence did not make promises. She listened. She took notes in a small book. She remembered their children's names. In the afternoons, she returned to the ledgers. She began to cross-reference her notes with the scant records. The problem with the lower fields wasn't just rain. A series of drainage ditches, marked on an old estate map, had been allowed to silt up completely. The cost to clear them would be £60.
But the restored pasture could support a flock of 200 sheep, yielding a profit of 3 times that within 2 years. She discovered the source of a long unpaid bill. A timber merchant had taken a stand of oaks 20 years ago and never settled the final invoice. The sum was £200. She wrote a letter to the merchant's son, a polite but firm inquiry, enclosing a copy of the original agreement she had found tucked into the back of a moldering book. She found the kitchen garden, a walled acre behind the main house. It was a wasteland of thorns and nettles. But along one crumbling brick wall, a single ancient rosemary bush had survived, its woody stems thick as a man's wrist. It was a sign of life, a sign of persistence. Prudence spent an hour every evening there, after her work with the books was done, her hands protected by worn leather gloves. She did not try to clear the whole acre. She started with the plot around the rosemary bush, pulling the weeds, turning the heavy soil, her muscles aching with the unfamiliar labor. Hannah watched her from the kitchen window, her expression unreadable. One evening, as Prudence came in, her face smudged with dirt, the housekeeper stood by the door with a basin of hot water and a clean cloth. She said nothing, but it was the first crack in the frost. It was an offering, a small, silent admission of respect. Prudence began to send her weekly reports to the Duke. They were not letters, they were balance sheets. Week ending September 23rd. Expenditures, £3, 4 shillings. Wages. Income, 0. Actions taken. Drainage survey of lower fields completed. Letter sent to T. Corbin and Son re outstanding invoice from 1827. Cleared 1/4 acre of kitchen garden. They were as stark and unadorned as the Duke's own speech. She included no personal commentary, no complaints, no pleas for help. She simply reported the facts. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Withercombe began to breathe again. Hob began polishing the silver in the dining room, even though no one was coming to dine. Tilly started humming as she worked. And Hannah, one crisp October morning, presented Prudence with a list. The tenants need seed for winter wheat, Miss Vickers, and the roof on the bailiff's cottage won't last another storm. I've calculated the costs. Prudence looked at the list, then at the formidable housekeeper. Hannah was no longer just a servant. She was an ally. "Thank you, Hannah," Prudence said. "We will see to it. Together." The word was unspoken, but it hung in the air between them, as solid and real as the newly sharpened axe leaning by the woodshed. The loyalty dominoes had begun to fall. A shift in perspective. The Duke of Kestrel Chase Gideon Devereux sat in his study at Kestrel Chase, the Withercombe report in his hand. It was the 5th he had received. Like the others, it was a model of clarity. Week ending October 21st. Expenditures, £62, 11 shillings. Roofing supplies for bailiff's cottage, initial payment for drainage works. Income, £200. Settlement from T. Corbin and Son. Actions taken. Drainage clearing commenced. Winter wheat seed distributed to tenants. 3 rooms on the ground floor of the main house cleaned and windows repaired. Kitchen garden fully cleared and prepared for winter planting. He spread the 5 reports on his desk.
a chronicle of quiet, relentless progress. He had expected letters filled with complaints, with feminine despair, with pleas to be rescued from the task he had set her. He remembered his late wife's correspondence from Withercombe. Pages of elegant, looping script detailing her melancholy, the oppressive silence, the ghastly wallpaper in the blue drawing room. She had seen the house as a reflection of her moods. Miss Vickers, it seemed, saw it as a ledger to be balanced. He picked up the first report again. Cleared 1/4 acre of kitchen garden. He could almost picture it, this plain, severe woman in her sturdy boots, her hands in the dirt, doing the work of a common gardener. There was no vanity in her, no sense of station. He had given her a ruin, and she had not wept over it. She had picked up a shovel. He had made the offer as a kind of experiment. He had been intrigued by the mind that could silence a room with a few remembered figures. He had also been weary of the grasping sycophants like Sinclair, the fluttering matriarchs like Lady Bellamy, the entire cloying performance of society. Prudence Vickers was different. She was real. Her silence was not sullen. It was focused. Her plainness was not an absence of beauty, but an absence of artifice. He had been so certain she would fail. He had wanted her to, in a way. It would have confirmed his view of the world, that it was a place of weakness and decay, where sentiment led only to ruin. His wife's love for Withercombe had nearly destroyed it. He had thought his own cold pragmatism was the only antidote. But Miss Vickers was proving him wrong. She was as pragmatic as he was, but her pragmatism was not cold. It was generative. It was creating order from chaos, life from neglect. She was not just balancing the books, she was reviving the heart of the place. He found himself looking forward to her weekly reports. They were the one honest piece of paper that crossed his desk. He thought of her in that decaying house, a single candle against a vast darkness. He had told her she would be begging to return by winter. Now, he found himself possessed of a strange, unwelcome thought. He hoped she would not. He hoped she would stay. The thought was a crack in the ice that had encased his heart for 5 years. It was disconcerting. It was also the first thing that had made him feel anything other than numb in a very long time. The news of Withercombe's slow resurrection trickled back to Marley, carried by merchants and travelers. It was spoken of with a kind of grudging wonder. The Duke's mad experiment, entrusting a failing estate to a spinster, seemed to be working. This news was particularly unwelcome to Mr. Osmond Sinclair. His courtship of Rosamond Bellamy was proceeding, but his own financial situation was becoming precarious. A series of poor investments had left him in need of a significant influx of cash, and Rosamond's dowry, while respectable, would not be enough to solve his problems. He had been counting on Lady Honora's influence, but with Prudence gone, the Bellamy household was descending into a state of genteel chaos that was becoming noticeable. Bills were going unpaid. Invitations were being missed. Lady Honora's temper was fraying, making her a less effective social operator. Sinclair, however, had other plans. During his initial inquiries into the Duke's holdings, part of his general assessment of the county's wealth, he had discovered something interesting. Withercombe possessed extensive tracts of old-growth oak, located in a remote part of the estate. The timber was immensely valuable, but the Duke, in his grief and seclusion, had never shown any interest in exploiting it. He saw an opportunity. A swift, profitable transaction that could solve all his problems before his creditors closed in. But to manage it, he needed information. He needed to know the state of the estate's management, and he needed to ensure that the quiet, annoyingly competent Miss Vickers did not get in his way. He arrived at Withercombe in mid-November, on a day of pale, watery sunlight. He presented himself as a concerned friend of the family, come to check on Prudence's well-being. Prudence received him in the small morning room, which now served as her office. It was no longer a shrine to a dead woman. The furniture was uncovered and polished, the windows were clean, and a small vase on the mantel held a sprig of the tough, persistent rosemary from the garden. The room was clean, orderly, and functional. It was a reflection of her. "Mr. Sinclair," she said, her tone perfectly neutral. "This is an unexpected visit." "My dear Prudence," he began, his smile as polished as ever. "I could not bear the thought of you languishing out here all alone. Lady Honora worries so." This was such a blatant lie that Prudence did not even bother to dignify it with a response. She simply waited. He looked around the room, his eyes taking in the changes. "You have worked wonders. The place looks habitable. The Duke must be very pleased." "I submit my reports weekly," she replied. Of course. All business you are," he laughed, a brittle sound. "I was just saying to a fellow at the club, the value in these old estates is often hidden. Timber, for instance. A man could make a fortune from a few 100 acres of good oak." He watched her face for any reaction. He saw none. Her expression remained one of polite inquiry. "The Duke has not indicated any interest in forestry," she said. "Ah, but a good steward might bring such opportunities to his attention, might she not?" he pressed, leaning forward conspiratorially. "I have some connections in that line of work. We could, perhaps, be of mutual benefit. A small commission for you, naturally, for your trouble." The offer hung in the air, greasy and insulting. He was assuming she was as venal as he was. He was assuming her loyalty could be purchased. "My instructions are to make the estate solvent through agriculture and tenancy, Mr. Sinclair," she said, her voice turning to ice. "My salary is £100 per annum. I require no commission." She stood, a clear signal that the interview was over. Sinclair's smile tightened. The plain little mouse had developed claws. He had underestimated her. "As you wish," he said, rising smoothly. "It was merely a thought. One hates to see an asset go to waste." He left a few minutes later, his charm curdling into resentment. If she would not be his partner, she would be an obstacle to be removed. He drove away from Withercombe not with a plan for partnership, but with a plan for sabotage. He knew the Duke was reclusive and trusted his agents. He knew the local magistrates were susceptible to the authority of a man of his apparent standing. And he knew that a woman's reputation, once smeared, was nearly impossible to clean. He would not go through Prudence Vickers. He would go around her. His new plan began to form as his carriage rattled back towards Marley. It was simple, elegant, and cruel. He would use the Duke's own reputation for remoteness against him. He would forge a document, a letter of authorization from the Duke's chief land agent, a man Sinclair knew to be wintering in Bath due to ill health. The letter would grant Sinclair the authority to sell the timber rights for the Withercombe Oaks to a company he secretly controlled, for a price that was criminally low. He would file the paperwork with the Marley magistrate, push the sale through, and have the first trees felled before anyone at Kestrel Chase was the wiser. And, to cover his tracks, to explain the sudden, desperate sale, he would seed a rumor. A simple, poisonous rumor. That the prim Miss Vickers, the so-called miracle worker, had been cooking the books all along. That her reports were a fiction, and that the estate was in such dire straits the Duke was being forced into a fire sale of its assets just to cover her incompetence. It was perfect. It would enrich him, ruin her, and by the time the truth came out, he and his money would be long gone. He began to compose the letter in his head, mimicking the agent's formal, slightly ponderous style. That is how counties turn on their own. Quietly, by degrees, with a whispered word and a plausible lie. Prudence Vickers had survived the autumn. He would ensure she did not survive the winter. The first frost of the year arrived at the end of November, silvering the overgrown lawns of Withercombe and turning the dark soil of the kitchen garden crisp. Prudence, rising in the pre-dawn chill, saw it from her window and felt not a sense of dread, but of satisfaction. The drainage ditches were cleared and flowing, the tenant cottages were watertight, the larder was stocked with provisions for the winter. She had met the Duke's challenge. Winter was coming, and she had no intention of begging to return to Marley. She was home. But in Marley, winter was coming for her reputation. Sinclair's poison began its work. It started in the taverns and the drawing rooms, a whispered comment here, a concerned question there. "Have you heard about Withercombe? Such a shame. It seems the Duke was misled." "Poor Miss Vickers, so out of her depth. They say the losses are staggering." Sinclair, meanwhile, paid a visit to Magistrate Fenwick, a man known for his rigid adherence to proper paperwork. He presented the forged letter of authorization. It looked impeccable. The signature was a masterful copy. The letterhead was perfect. "A sad business, Magistrate," Sinclair said, his face a mask of solemn concern. "The Duke is a proud man. He wishes to handle this quietly. The estate is bleeding money. This sale will staunch the wound." Magistrate Fenwick, a shrewd but busy man, examined the document. It appeared to be in perfect order. The Duke's agent was indeed in Bath. The urgency seemed plausible. He saw no reason to doubt a gentleman like Mr. Sinclair, who was, after all, soon to be connected to the respectable Bellamy family. He stamped the preliminary paperwork. The sale of the Withercombe Oaks was set in motion. The crisis arrived at Withercombe on a Tuesday, carried not by a rumor, but by the Duke himself. Prudence was in her office, reconciling the week's accounts, when she heard the sound of a powerful horse ridden hard into the stable yard. A few moments later, Hob appeared at the door, his face pale. "His Grace, the Duke," he announced, his voice a strained whisper. Gideon Devereux filled the doorway. He was not dressed for a social call. He wore riding boots spattered with mud and a heavy greatcoat dusted with road grime. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes holding the full chill of the winter sky. The warmth that Prudence had imagined she'd glimpsed in his letters was gone, replaced by the granite severity she remembered from their first meeting. "Miss Vickers," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of any courtesy. He did not wait for an invitation to enter. He strode to the center of the room, his presence sucking all the air from it. He held a folded piece of paper in his gloved hand. "I was in Marley on unrelated business. A rumor reached me. A rumor of a timber sale." He did not look at her as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the cold hearth. "I made inquiries. Magistrate Fenwick was good enough to show me this." He unfolded the paper and laid it on her desk. It was a copy of the letter of authorization, supposedly from his agent, granting Osmond Sinclair the right to sell the Withercombe Oaks. This was the moment, the test. All her work, all the small victories, the trust she had built with the staff and tenants, it all balanced on the knife edge of this confrontation. He had heard the rumors. He had seen a document that accused her, by implication, of catastrophic failure. He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. His expression was cold, guarded, but behind the anger, she saw something else, a question. He was not accusing her, he was asking. "What do you know of this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Prudence looked from his face to the document. She saw Sinclair's ambition and cruelty laid out in elegant, forged script. She felt a surge of cold fury, but her face remained a calm mask. Hysteria would be an admission of guilt. Panic would be a confession.
She had learned self-control in the cruelest of schools, her aunt's drawing room. It would serve her now. She met his gaze without wavering. Her own voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension in the room like glass. "I know nothing of this, Your Grace," she said. "It is a forgery." She let the words settle in the silence. 1 second. 2. He did not speak, simply watched her, weighing her. She did not wait for him to question her further. She turned to the tall cabinet where she kept her records. Her hands were perfectly steady. She retrieved the new Withercombe ledger, the one she had started on her first day. She opened it on the desk next to the forged letter. "Here are the accounts, Your Grace, updated as of this morning. You will find no record of any such transaction." Her finger, slender and unadorned, traced the neat columns of figures. "You will see the payment from Corbin and Son. You will see the expenditures for the roof and the drainage. You will see that the estate is, for the first time in 5 years, operating without a loss." She then produced another file. "This is my correspondence. Here is a letter I received from your agent, Mr. Davies, from Bath 3 weeks ago. It concerns a tenancy question at Home Farm. You will note the signature. It does not match the one on that document." Finally, she laid out her weekly reports, the 5 stark summaries of her stewardship. "My work is all here, Your Grace. Every penny is accounted for. I have not failed you." Gideon Devereux stood in silence, his gaze moving from the forged letter to her meticulous ledger, to the genuine correspondence, and back to her face. He saw no fear, no duplicity. He saw the same quiet, unshakable competence he had first witnessed at that disastrous dinner party. He saw truth, presented not with pleading, but with evidence. He picked up the copy of the forgery and the letter from his agent. He compared the signatures. The differences were subtle, but undeniable to a man who had been signing documents with Davies for a decade. Then he looked at her ledger, at the clean lines and the balanced accounts. It was the work of an honest mind. The icy mask of his anger began to fracture. The rumor was a lie. The document was a fraud. And the woman standing before him was not a failure. She was the victim of a calculated attack. He looked at the forged letter again, a new, cold fury taking hold. He had seen that slightly ostentatious flourish on the S before, in a guest book, at Lady Bellamy's house. "Sinclair," he said, the name an exhalation of contempt. "Yes," Prudence affirmed. "He was here 2 weeks ago. He offered me a commission to help him sell the timber." The last piece of the puzzle slotted into place. It was a simple, greedy plot, and at its heart was an attempt to ruin her. A deep, protective anger rose in him, an emotion so unfamiliar he barely recognized it. He slowly folded the forged document and tucked it into his coat. The crisis had passed. Trust had been tested, and it had held. He looked at Prudence, truly looked at her, and saw not just a competent steward, but a woman of extraordinary fortitude. She had faced him down, not with defiance, but with dignity and facts. "Miss Vickers," he said, and his voice was different now. The coldness was gone, replaced by a low, resonant gravity. "It appears an apology is owed, not by you, but to you." He paused. "And a reckoning is owed to Mr. Sinclair, a public one." We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The Duke did not linger at Withercombe. He stayed only long enough for a fresh horse to be saddled and to give Prudence a set of clear, concise instructions. A meeting was to be arranged at the town hall in Marley in 3 days' time. He would send formal invitations. Magistrate Fenwick was to be requested to attend, along with Lady Honora Bellamy, Miss Rosamond Bellamy, and, of course, Mr.
Osmond Sinclair. The stated purpose of the gathering was to discuss the future of the Withercombe estate and to make a public announcement regarding its management. "You will be there, Miss Vickers," he had said, his hand on his horse's reins, "and you will bring your ledger." It was not a request. Prudence had simply nodded.
"I will be there, Your Grace."
The 3 days leading up to the meeting were a strange mixture of calm and suspense at Withercombe. The rhythms of the estate continued. Prudence oversaw the final winter preparations, her mind clear and focused on her duties. But beneath the surface, a current of anticipation ran through the small household. Hannah watched her with a fierce, protective gaze. Hob polished the brass on Prudence's traveling case until it shone like gold. They did not know the details of what was to come, but they knew their mistress had been wronged, and that a battle was imminent. On the morning of the meeting, Prudence dressed with care. She chose her best dress, a simple gown of dark gray wool, severe but well made. It was the dress of a woman who meant business. She did not wear jewelry, save for the dented silver locket at her throat. As she prepared to leave, Hannah pressed a small, hot brick wrapped in flannel into her hands. "For the journey, miss. The wind is sharp today." It was a gesture of profound loyalty, a soldier's comfort offered before a campaign. The town hall in Marley was a stern, imposing building. The meeting was to be held in the council chamber, a wood-paneled room that smelled of beeswax and old paper. When Prudence entered, the others were already assembled. Lady Honora and Rosamond sat to one side, their expressions a mixture of confusion and social anxiety. Magistrate Fenwick sat at the head of a long table, looking stern and official. And there, standing by the window, was Osmond Sinclair. He looked magnificent, dressed in the height of fashion, a picture of confident affluence. He gave Prudence a small, condescending smile as she entered, the smile of a man who believed he had already won. He thought this meeting was about the formal transfer of the timber rights. He thought she was here to be formally dismissed. Prudence took a seat opposite him, placing her ledger on the table before her. She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable, and held it until he looked away. The Duke arrived last, precisely on the hour. He moved with a quiet authority that made every other man in the room seem smaller. He gave a formal nod to the magistrate, then let his gaze sweep over the assembled party, resting for a moment on Sinclair with an unnerving lack of expression. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice filling the quiet room. "I have called this meeting to clear up certain misunderstandings regarding my property at Withercombe." He looked directly at Prudence. "Miss Vickers was appointed steward in September with one goal: to make the estate solvent. There have been rumors that she has failed in this task, that the estate is, in fact, in a worse state than ever." Lady Honora shifted uncomfortably. This was the story she herself had been spreading, fueled by Sinclair's insinuations. "These rumors are false," the Duke stated flatly. "Withercombe is not failing. On the contrary." He gestured to the ledger in front of Prudence. "Miss Vickers, would you be so good as to inform the magistrate of the estate's current financial standing?" Prudence opened the book. In a clear, calm voice, she read out the summary of the last quarter. She detailed the income from the resolved debt, The savings from renegotiated contracts, the projected income from the restored pasture land. She concluded, "As of this morning, the Withercombe estate is operating at a net profit of £132. A stunned silence fell over the room. Magistrate Fenwick's eyebrows shot up. Lady Honora looked aghast. Rosamond simply looked confused.
Sinclair's smile had vanished. A flicker of unease crossed his face. This was not going according to his plan.
"An impressive turnaround," the magistrate noted, looking at Prudence with new respect. "Indeed," the Duke agreed, his voice like silk-wrapped steel. "Which brings us to another matter. Given this newfound solvency, it is curious that a proposal was brought to the magistrate for an emergency sale of the estate's most valuable timber assets." He turned his full attention to Sinclair. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. "Mr. Sinclair, you presented this proposal. Perhaps you would care to explain the necessity for such a sale." Sinclair, trapped, attempted to bluff. "Your Grace, I was acting on what I believed to be good information, that the estate was in peril. I sought only to help." "You sought to help by arranging the sale of my property, to a company of which you are the sole director, for less than a third of its market value?" the Duke inquired softly. Sinclair's face went pale. "That is a baseless accusation." "Is it?" The Duke produced a sheaf of papers. "Here are the incorporation documents for the Marley Timber Consortium. And here," he added, producing another man who had been waiting in the antechamber, "is Mr. Graves, a licensed timber assessor from Kingsbrook, who valued the Withercombe oaks this morning at my request. His valuation is just over £3,000. Your proposed sale price was £800. Sinclair began to sweat. "The authorization. I had the authorization from your agent." "Ah, the authorization." The Duke nodded to the door again. A frail, elderly man leaning on a cane entered the room. "Magistrate, ladies, may I present Mr. Davies, my chief land agent. I took the liberty of sending my personal carriage to bring him from Bath this morning. He was most surprised to learn of the letter he had supposedly written." Mr. Davies looked at Sinclair witheringly. "I have never seen that man before in my life," he rasped. "And I certainly did not authorize the sale of His Grace's property. That signature is a clumsy forgery." It was over. The trap had closed. Sinclair stood exposed, his lies stripped away layer by layer in front of the very people he had sought to impress and defraud. He looked wildly around the room, finding no sympathy. Lady Honora stared at him with horror, realizing she had championed a common criminal. Rosamond had tears welling in her eyes, a mixture of fear and humiliation. Magistrate Fenwick's face was like stone. He struck the table with his gavel, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. "Mr. Sinclair, this is a matter of fraud and forgery. I am issuing a warrant for your arrest." As two constables entered the room to take a trembling, protesting Sinclair into custody, the Duke walked over to where Prudence sat. She had not moved. She had watched the entire proceeding with a calm, quiet intensity. She had been the still center of the storm. He stopped before her, and for a moment it seemed he might offer a formal word of thanks. But he did something else entirely. In front of the magistrate, her aunt, and her cousin Gideon Devereux, the cold, reclusive Duke of Kestrel Chase went down on one knee. The collective gasp was audible. He did not take her hand. He simply looked up at her, his winter sky eyes now clear and direct,
holding an emotion she did not dare to name. "Miss Vickers," he began, his voice low, but carrying to every corner of the room. "When I sent you to Withercombe, I predicted you would fail. I was wrong. You did not merely save a failing estate. You reminded me that things which are broken can be mended, that houses which are cold can be made warm, and that honesty and competence are virtues rarer and more valuable than any title." He paused, and his next words were not for the room, but for her alone. "The first snow of the season is predicted for next week, and I find I am the one who is begging. Not for you to return to Marley, but for you never to leave Withercombe." He took a breath. "I have instructed my solicitor to draw up the deed. The estate is now yours. You did not inherit it. You did not marry into it. You earned it. You bought it, not with coin, but with character." Prudence stared at him, her mind reeling. Withercombe was hers. The thought was too vast to comprehend. The security, the independence. It was everything she had never allowed herself to dream of. "But I do not want you to be the mistress of Withercombe alone," he continued, his voice softening further. "I am asking you to be the Duchess of Kestrel Chase. I am asking you to be my wife, to bring your strength and your light into my house and into my life." He did not speak of love in poetic terms. He spoke of partnership, of recognition, of a shared future. It was a language she understood perfectly. It was a proposal built on the bedrock of respect. "I am asking," he said again, his gaze unwavering. "Answer plainly." Prudence looked down at the powerful Duke kneeling before her. She saw not a rescuer, but a partner. She thought of the cold rooms at her aunt's house and the warm, hopeful silence of Withercombe. She had found her place in the world, not by fortune or by beauty, but by the strength of her own mind and hands. And now, this man was offering to stand beside her in it. A single, slow smile touched her lips, the first true smile he had ever seen from her. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Plainly. Yes." An epilogue. 1 year later. The first snow of winter was falling, thick and silent, blanketing the grounds of Withercombe in a mantle of pure white. But inside the house, all was warmth and light. Fires crackled in every hearth, the scent of beeswax and baking bread hung in the air, and the sound of laughter could be heard from the kitchens, where Hannah now presided over a bustling staff with cheerful, iron-willed authority. In the small office that had once been Prudence's command centre, Gideon and Prudence, now the Duke and Duchess of Kestrel Chase, sat together at the desk, their heads bent over the estate ledger. "Another £30 profit from the wool," Gideon murmured, tracing a line with his finger. "You are a marvel, Prudence." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder for a moment. "We are a marvel, Gideon. The drainage was your idea." "The idea was nothing. The execution was yours." Their life together had settled into a rhythm of quiet companionship and mutual respect. He had brought his resources and his deep, surprising knowledge of land management to her meticulous organization and financial acumen. Together, they were making not just Withercombe, but all the Devereux estates thrive. He had opened the cold, shuttered rooms of his life, and she had filled them with light and order. Rosamond had, to everyone's surprise, made a quiet and sensible match with a country doctor from a neighbouring parish. Humbled by Sinclair's disgrace and her mother's subsequent social collapse, she had discovered a capacity for contentment she never knew she possessed.
Lady Honora lived in Bath, in reduced circumstances, her days filled with complaining about the price of tea and the ingratitude of nieces. Gideon reached out and gently touched the small, dented silver locket that Prudence still wore. It was a familiar, beloved object to him now. "May I?" he asked softly. She nodded. With practiced fingers, he opened the little clasp. He knew what he would find inside. It was not a portrait of a lost love or a lock of hair. It was a tiny, perfectly pressed wildflower, its colour faded to a pale, ghostly blue. It was the wildflower from her mother's watercolour, the one she had tried to replicate. "I could never find one," she had told him once. "It grew near my childhood home."
They call it the winter hardy. It blooms even after the first frost. He had listened to the story, then spent a month corresponding with botanists across the country. He looked from the pressed flower in the locket to the window, where the snow was falling on the revived gardens of Withercombe. He smiled, a slow, warm smile, but was now reserved for her alone. "I believe," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble, "that if you look by the south wall, near the rosemary bush, you will find it is not the only one to bloom after the first frost this year." He closed the locket gently, his fingers warm over hers. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss not of grand passion, but of deep, abiding peace. Outside, the snow fell on the sleeping gardens, and inside, in the heart of the house she had saved, the Duchess of Kestrel Chase was finally, truly, home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.